Hello, welcome to Bankless. David and I run a podcast we call Bankless, and it's all about the journey towards DeFi, all about the journey towards using less banks and more decentralized finance in your life. And we are super excited to present you with this Ethereum Down Under panel where we're going to explore what Australia's doing in DeFi. And it's a lot. David, you want to introduce the guests on this panel for us?
Oh, absolutely. As if any of them actually need any introduction, but we will introduce them anyways. Coming in the front and middle, you will see Kain Warwick, co-founder of the Synthetix protocol. In the bottom left, you got Sid Powell, who's the co-founder of Maple Finance. And in the bottom center, we got Patrick McNab, who's one of the lead contributors towards Tracer DAO. And also, last but not least, in the bottom right corner, you see Robbie Ferguson, one of the co-founders of Immutable. Guys, Aussies, welcome to the Bankless live stream. How's it going?
Going great. Pleasure to be here, guys. Thanks very much for jumping on.
Awesome to be here.
Yeah.
Well, we're excited.
I actually
to
just
do
got
this.
back to Sydney like 2 days ago, so yeah, it's nice to be joining our panel.
Welcome back, Kain. Welcome back to Australia. I gotta start the question. Maybe this is for everybody who's not in Australia, but like, how does Australia have so many fantastic DeFi teams? Like, what is it about Australia that attracts so many cool projects and a lot of the DeFi talent? Kain, what are your thoughts on this?
So back in 2017, when I was starting Haven, I think there were two projects that people knew from Australia. There was Power Ledger, because they just done a big ICO, like a $30 million ICO, a $25 million ICO. And then there was CoinJar, because Asher from CoinJar had started back in like 2012. He was an OG, Bitcoin OG, still a bit of a Bitcoin maxi, but we won't hold that against him. And that was kind of it. Like, that was literally it. Like, if you asked anyone in the US or Europe or whatever about like anything else in Australia, they'd be like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Like, what? There's nothing, right? And it was actually really hard because when we started doing the raise and we were talking to VCs, particularly VCs who are like in West Coast US, they were like, why are you in Australia? Like, legitimately, we got that question all the time, right? They were like, why aren't you in a real place? Why don't you like come to like SF or like New York or something like that? And I think, we kind of pushed back and said, well, like, this is, DeFi, right? This is crypto. You can do it from anywhere. But there were definitely people, and even like people in Asia that were like very skeptical about this idea of like Australia having, crypto scene, even though we did have like a pretty big local crypto scene. We had a lot of different crypto exchanges and, there was stuff going on, but it never really got outside of Australia. And I think it wasn't until probably like 2019 when like Synthetix actually started to do well that it became a little bit easier for people to kind of turn up and be like, no, we're Australia based. And then we had a bunch of good projects that kind of, came after that, and Australian crypto became a bit of a meme, right? And like, I remember talking to Sid, and he was like going on raising money and people were like, oh, you're Australian. That's amazing. Here's a sack of cash. And you're like, wait, what? Like, what's going on here? So I think it's been like quite a journey, but we're at a point now where like people hear about an Australian project and it's actually like a bonus as opposed to back in the day when it was like, why are you doing this? Like, come to America or something like that. So it's taken a while, but I think we're now at a point where like we've demonstrated that Australia is a really good place to go crypto.
So that's incredible. So Sid, what's your experience with the Australian DeFi brand? Are people like handing you sacks of cash because you're from Australia?
Yeah, well, I think as Kain said, once we got into 2020, then if you're an Australian project working in DeFi, it became significantly easier to raise money. And I think a lot of that was to do with the network effect. Like, if you're going out and trying to build something, it's a lot easier when you can actually talk to people who have already gone through a similar experience before. And so Kain was really like super helpful in terms of giving advice and introductions as we were going through that raising process. And I think, hopefully we've been able to do the same thing for other newer projects that have come through and newer builders. And I think that's just helped to kind of build this network effect and a bit of a reputation around Aussie DeFi projects that like we just know what we're doing. And that if you get kind of the buy-in or the vetting of other founders from Australia, then, it's obviously a bit of a tick of approval.
Robbie, what is it for you guys at Immutable? I mean, building Gods Unchained, of course. What is it about the Australian blockchain crypto scene that is interesting or appealing?
I think crypto is the first time that Australian founders have been able to be fundraising on a level footing with the rest of the world. So the story about us is back at the start of 2018, after we had released Etherbots, which was the first multiplayer game on any blockchain, we tried to fundraise for 2 months in Australia. No luck. As soon as we went to Consensus in New York, within 2 days, the entire round had been full. And so crypto, I think, has given this unique opportunity for sort of Australian founders to participate in global fundraising. And there is a ton of really, really good talent in Australia. I mean, I think we have one of the best educational systems in the world. We have a pretty high risk tolerance in general, which is useful for entrepreneurship in crypto. And then I completely agree. I think we're seeing the trickle down effects of the crypto mafia being built out of brands like Synthetix. I think we're even seeing that out of some ex-Immutables. We had Zora be co-founded by an ex-Immutable. The Lyra Finance folks I know worked on the earliest versions of Haven and Synthetix. So it's definitely people who see that kind of flywheel turning of, okay, more VCs investing, it's less risky to join in as an Australian founder, and then more VC capital pours in. This is all concomitant with the fact that we're having the biggest Aussie tech successes ever. Like Aussie tech was dead a decade ago, and now we have Atlassian, we have Canva, we have VC firms raising billions of dollars off the back of those successes. And I think this is very much the beginning of a great couple of decades for Aussie tech.
Wow, the beginning of a great couple of decades for Aussie tech and maybe Aussie DeFi as well. So Patrick, round us out here. So what's it like to start a new DeFi protocol, new primitive like Tracer in this generation of Aussie DeFi and Aussie crypto?
Yeah, certainly echoing a lot of points of the guys already. I think standing on the shoulders of giants within the industry certainly helps. There's been a lot of innovation, a lot of great entities that have formed out of Australia. But I think maybe going into the why DeFi, why crypto for Aussies a little bit more, I think there's almost an element of financial repression here with some people in Australia. I think that the financial markets are some of the most regulated markets here in the world, and there's not a lot of room for experimentation within the financial markets. And I think DeFi particularly speaks to people that are creative, and it's an outlet for people to experiment and to innovate in this landscape. And I think with that, alongside the fact that Australia's got one of the most prominent gambling industries in the world, there's that natural tendency for Australians to jump into decentralized finance and really try and create a new financial stack.
Guys, I want to tap into some of the differences that people from outside of Australia might not be familiar with what it's like to be in Australia. How is the Australian financial system different from what we would expect here in America or from in Europe? And also, Pat, you just touched on this. I want to go down into this a little bit more. Just the disposition of the Australian people. Like, how is the Australian culture different, and how is that relevant to crypto? Mainly, just what are the differences to being a builder in Australia? How is crypto used differently in Australia? How is regulation different in Australia? Pick your angle, pick your variable that you want to touch on, and just tell us a little bit about the differences between Australian crypto and rest of the world. Pat, I'll throw it back to you to start, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, with DeFi, it all sort of compiles down to the EVM bytecode at the end of the day. So with respect to how we're completely different from the rest of the industry in our structure within DeFi, it's not super clear. There's a massive difference. I think we're globally competitive from the same landscape in the sense that we're all operating on the same substrate. But no, there's a variety of different cryptocurrency exchanges within Australia that have been prolific at the spot market level. And I think yesterday, SBF here at the Blockchain Week event announced that FTX would be rolling into Australia as well. So there's plenty of emerging licenses being issued, and the market's really starting to be regulated in the ways that I suppose are needed for mass adoption to a degree. So I think, yeah, we've got a competitive landscape, that's for sure.
Robbie, I want to throw that same question to you. What stands out as the biggest difference when it comes to crypto and how it relates to government, finance, the people of Australia? What stands out to you the most?
That the government hasn't taken an active opposition to it. I think it's probably the number one discriminator between us and the US. It is still yet to be decided. And I think we have a much higher chance to actually get kind of government buy-in, probably because we don't have the global reserve currency, and it's not a threat by sort of synthetics and derivatives, which is it just makes it easier for our government to kind of swallow it down. But then the other thing is it's just very cheap to politically lobby in Australia. It's like 20 times cheaper than the States. And so, many people on this call are all having and building these relationships with Oz regulators and politicians. So hopefully we can bring it to to be the new kind of crypto Bahamas or the place where people want to go and found crypto startups.
Sid, I want to ask you that same question. What is the big differences that stands out when with regards to Australian crypto?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. So to kind of touch and just build on what Robbie said. So you actually have a fairly complex legal and regulatory structure in that the Corps Act is super comprehensive and actually quite restrictive. But I think what you've seen is kind of a posture of the government sort of willing to have conversations with new projects. And I think that stems from kind of from Australia being a smaller economy and a smaller market. So I think they're quite conscious that if you make it too difficult to do business here, then you will just have teams kind of go offshore because it is a naturally smaller market, and so it can just be easy to sort of bypass it. So I think that's been quite favorable, and so I'm actually quite bullish on where the discussions will go. And then the other element is kind of the Australian banking and financial market structure is quite concentrated, and so that means that you actually have like an overrepresentation of people who kind of come from financial services, and I think that's helped us overrepresent in terms of the number of founders in the space who come out of Australia. But it means that our teams are quite naturally hybrid. Like we have a lot of people with financial services experience, so it's like we can brainstorm how a DeFi product or protocol should work. But then we have to go offshore to hire the talent because there's not the same level of STEM representation in Australia. So I'd say that kind of creates a unique perspective where you actually have teams that are sort of straddling different jurisdictions and markets.
So I'm getting the gist that you guys don't have your own version of Gary Gensler in your guys's regulatory environment. Kain, what about you? What are the differences that stand out to you?
Thank God for that as well. One is too many. We don't need an Aussie Gary Gensler. Jesus. So I think I grew up in the States, right? So my perspective is kind of interesting because I've spent half my life in the US, half my life in Australia. And so I think for me, some of the cultural aspects of Australia were quite interesting in comparison to the US, right? Like we are not a super risk averse culture, but I think that for a long time, the best founders would leave and they would go to like New York or London or, San Francisco or the Valley or whatever. And so we didn't have a lot of like homegrown icons of like, startup success, right? Like the people who were like, in the paper for being super successful were like literally digging like rocks out of the ground, right? And people were like, that guy's amazing. Look at how he digs rocks out of the ground. It's incredible, right? We just didn't have this model for people to like say, actually, I can do this thing, right? So even though you had a lot of people who were in a position, I think financially and socially where we've got a really good safety net, and the downside of like doing entrepreneurship is really low in Australia, right? Like you drop out of uni and you go and do that, like you're not going to end up in like a gutter like you would in the States, right? Where like it's very extreme in terms of what the downside is for you, like in society. Like in Australia, worst case, you're like living on Bondi Beach, like chilling out, get paid a couple $100 a week, right? There's not much downside to you, and yet we didn't have people willing to kind of make that leap to like, let's go and try and build something. But I think it's only been in the last like 5 or 10 years, Robbie's point about like, Atlassian, right? Like people see the Atlassian co-founders and they're like, wait a second, like we can do this. Like we can actually build a SaaS company from Australia, not leave, stay here, reinvest, etc. And I think the point is very valid that this is only just getting started. And I think when you add on to the fact from a crypto perspective that regulators have been super permissive, way more permissive than I ever expected them to be, right? Like no regulator has ever come up to anyone in Synthetix and been like, stop doing what you're doing, or even like, why are you doing this or whatever, right? And I do think that attitude of like only really going after outright fraud and things that are like very clearly detrimental and just an assumption that people who are building novel things are good actors has really put us in a very good place, right? Where like, you know, Synthetix, we're good actors. Like we believe in regulation. We believe things should, you know, we believe in fair markets. We believe in transparency. We think that DeFi is the way to get there. And so not kind of squashing that immediately with like overregulation or whatever, I think has allowed this to flourish. And we're like genuinely only getting started. I think it's only going to get better from here.
Must be nice.
Yeah, I was going to say, can you guys teach the US how to do this?
I know, right?
Like for real, like I'm just curious. Do you think there's opportunity for Australia to be a leader on the global stage in this respect? Not only with respect to the entrepreneurship in Australian DeFi, but also from a global regulatory leadership position, because every single regulator in every Western democracy is asking themselves, what do we do with this DeFi question? Is there an opportunity for Australia to like show the way forward? Kain, that's a question to you first.
Yeah, so I think so, right? But there are also like structural issues with Australia, right? It's really fucking far away from everywhere. So trying to convince someone to come and like live in Australia and operate here is hard. That said, trying to convince people to domicile in Australia, or to start a DAO or something like that, and everything's global now. Like the majority of the Synthetix core contributors are not in Australia. I think we're down to like there's 6 in Australia out of like 35 or something like that, right? The vast majority are here. Obviously, that's different to things like Immutable, where like they've got a big office here. But even still, I think Immutable has a lot of people overseas versus who's in Australia. So it then comes down to like, okay, so if regulators are willing to be permissive, they're willing to be open, they're willing to kind of allow good actors to do things and experiment, then you're going to get this compounding return where like things just get better and better and better, and you have more success and more experimentation. I don't know that it's possible for like the US to replicate that though, right? Like replicating that just there's something about Australia in the way that like the market is structured, which I think allows for this to happen and for it to be like lower stakes. I think in the US, the stakes are too high for regulators to be as permissive as they are in Australia. There are too many stakeholders. There's too much conflict of interest. Like it's just hard for that to work. I don't think you can take this Australian model and replicate it.
Tax is another big inhibitor. I think Australia's corporate tax rates are much higher than America. So that'll be our hold up. We have to kind of jump.
You could see some innovations, like if there are Australian innovations on the legal side, like for example, incorporating DAOs as legal entities, then that might set a pretty good example for certain states to follow in the US, like potentially Florida, which is definitely one of the more crypto progressive states. Wyoming being another one that comes to mind, and I think that would gradually kind of introduce the notion of DeFi being more legitimized in the States from a regulatory perspective.
Totally. And I think this is something that we've been very forthcoming with on the Tracer front and Mycelium front particularly, in pushing for like appropriate DAO regulation here in Australia. Jack Deeb on our side, he's been working with the Koala group, who's just an international body that's looking at DAO regulation in different jurisdictions and how to most appropriately model law such that it can fit into the relevant schemes. And I think every stakeholder that we've interacted with in Australia and we've been pushing to educate so far, and it's extremely positive, has just been very receptive to learn. And to everyone's point so far, it's been just welcoming, I suppose. They don't want to stifle or they don't want to stifle innovation. They don't want to stop things from progressing. They just want to ensure that there's the appropriate environment for people to continue to innovate, which I think it's really positive.
Yeah. Like I alluded to, definitely very jealous of the environment that you guys have described of what's going on down there. I actually want to turn this conversation to a current event that I would imagine would be very relevant to be talked about at an Australian blockchain week. You guys had an exchange pause or turn off recently, the ASX 24 futures market, I believe. I'm just learning about this again because I'm a naive American, but it was unavailable for most of Friday. And they said that it was turned off due to technical disruptions and hardware failures. And I'm wondering, what's the talk of the town down at the conference? Is this like a timely, relevant topic for crypto people to be discussing? And is this being viewed by the greater just like landscape of Australia as a crypto relevant subject, or have people not connected those dots yet? Kain, I'll start with you since I think your project is most relevant to this.
I'm like so detached from TradFi that I didn't even have any idea that happened, to be honest. So I probably can't speak to it. Maybe one of the other guys has an opinion.
Yeah, Sid, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating. Like, I mean, for the longest time, we've been kind of rattling about how, you know, in Australia you can't do banking transfers outside of regular hours. You know, you can go to the supermarket, but you can't send money around. Like the whole financial economy stops outside of regular 9 to 5 hours. And so to have this kind of futures exchange down, I think, you know, it points, it'll be like, it's not well accepted now, but I think it'll be sort of deemed quite obvious. Like, why didn't we consider it important enough that financial markets should basically be always on? And I think that's like the power of DeFi, right? Is you can lend money at any time of day. You can trade futures or other instruments or spot. And this is really important if you're going to be integrated as part of the world economy. Like the rest of the world isn't sleeping, and so the idea that you would just have such restricted hours and also infrastructure that can go down like that, I think really points to the strength of DeFi as core. You know, it's one of the core value propositions.
Totally, and I think that's an element of why we're all here as well, the decentralized market infrastructure and being able to create something that's robust and it doesn't have that single point of failure. I believe that nickel spillout was from the Ukrainian sanctions. I think something flowed that way, and the LSE got caught up in it as well. And there was a few issues of bags being dropped in different areas and people trying to pick it up and no one on the other end. But I think with what we're building, ideally these things don't happen moving forwards. And to Sid's point, we do have global 24/7 markets where everyone can access them at all times, and there's no one that can really just click their fingers and turn them off. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing.
We were just recently... Oh yeah, go ahead, Robbie.
I was just going to quickly say the ASX has actually chosen already a tech partner to replace the chess system, which is kind of the system that under the hood powering these transactions, with a blockchain. And at the moment, it's not as if it's on Ethereum or anything open, but like that's an incredible willingness and progressiveness. And they started this RFP back in 2015. So I actually, out of all kind of stock markets in the world, I think the ASX is probably positioned to do this transition for a big economy the fastest.
Wow, that's huge. Yeah, because, okay, you guys are telling a story of just the regulatory environment just being very favorable to innovation, but not just that, but also the companies and platforms that already exist itself being open to new technologies. And so kind of my original question were people viewing this inside of a frame of crypto? Like, oh, an exchange went down. Are people savvy enough to understand like, oh, crypto fixes this? And it sounds to me that like, no, it's super obvious and everyone's kind of up to speed on that. Is that right, Robbie?
Well, ultimately, Australia is a country which has gotten very rich over the last 2 decades by two things. One is a massive amount of natural commodities in kind of oil and gas and coal, which we've just been exporting. And now that's mainly run out, and those export partners are, in some cases, placing tariffs on us. And we realized we actually need a way to sustain this economy in the future. The only reason we're even reasonable today is we massively invested into super. And we said everyone had to lock up 10% of their earnings for kind of long-term pensions. And so I think we're in this unique position where the government very badly wants to, or at least private actors certainly, and the government is just like less powerful compared to private actors than in other places around the world, that they would just want to start off this tech industry. And I actually think that's another part of this long-term debt cycle is countries like the US have a lot more to lose, but they also assume that the tech industry will stay there together, like forever, and that they kind of take it for granted. And we've seen with literally like, the mayors of Austin and kind of Miami coming out and making a big play to encourage founders to come build there, rather than just being like, yeah, of course you're going to build here. San Francisco is the home of tech. Is like this stuff matters. Being personable, making customized pitches, and actually trying to have key leaders developing this stuff really matters. I think we're getting that in Australia at the moment, and we just have a lot more to gain and a lot less to lose.
So we've been talking about Australia a lot. We want to kind of switch gears and talk a bit more specifically about DeFi. And DeFi, decentralized finance, has had a really interesting trajectory. I remember a time when it didn't even exist. And we saw in 2018, 2019, some early projects trying to like carve out space in DeFi, but the rest of the world didn't really know it existed. And there were a set of early adopters. And then in 2020, DeFi had this breakout moment. In 2021, that sort of accelerated. And now maybe has things slowed down a little bit. At least the hype cycle is a bit more towards NFTs, and yet the builders are continuing to build. So I want to ask the panelists here about trends, about the future of DeFi, about what you guys see ahead for this rapidly developing software space where software is eating the banking system, software is eating finance. So tell us a little bit about the trends. I want to maybe start back with you, Kain. What are some of the things happening in DeFi right now? Some of the trends, some of the things that people should be taking notice of?
So I think there's now multiple threads of DeFi going on, right? Which is one of the reasons, all of us on this panel, I think for maybe the people at the top are a little bit more extreme than others, are pretty deep down the ETH rabbit hole. But I think all of us are pretty aligned with the Ethereum ecosystem, right? And I think what happened is that alignment that a lot of the early DeFi builders had and still have, you go back to like people like Rune, right? Like very, like deeply, engaged in the Ethereum ecosystem. Hayden, like the people who were building early DeFi are very deeply aligned with Ethereum. And I think that there was a disconnect when the fee market for block space in Ethereum broke, right? And we got to a point where like it was actually not possible for a new entrant to interact with DeFi on Ethereum. It was just like cost prohibitive, right? And a lot of us who had a lot of ETH, which is how you pay for gas, were a bit oblivious to it, right? And myself included. And we're like, oh, it's not too bad. Like, I pay like 0.1 ETH to do a transaction, but like, because I'm denominated in ETH, right? And I'm like, oh, like it's the same amount. It's just that it's worth a lot more, right? A new person coming in is like, I have dollars and you're telling me it's going to cost like $1,000 to do this transaction. Like, that's just not viable for me. And so we saw for the first time, I think in like 2021, the emergence of like genuine organic non-Ethereum DeFi communities, right? And yeah, a lot of it was like rug coins and copy pasta stuff and like a lot of nonsense, but there actually was genuine activity. And I think a lot of us were oblivious to it. What's now happening is we've finally gotten our shit together and gotten scaling of Ethereum to a point where we can make a credible case to a new entrant in the ecosystem that it is viable for you to transact within the Ethereum ecosystem again, right? Other than Polygon, there was really no option, right? Starkware, yes, but like it's very much a siloed thing. We didn't have like a composable DeFi substrate on which to build on for a while because it was just too expensive. And now we've got Arbitrum, we've got Optimism, we've got, there's multiple different rollups that are coming out. Starknet's getting closer. I think in the next like 3 to 6 months, we're going to have this Ethereum DeFi renaissance where like all of the best builders, no offense to people in the Solana ecosystem, whatever, are still building on Ethereum. It's just that we couldn't attract users because it was too fucking expensive to actually use our cool stuff that we were building, right? And now all of a sudden, you're gonna have like EIP, 4844, that's going to bring transaction costs below that of like BSC. right? And it's going to be cheaper to actually transact on, Optimism and Arbitrum than it is to go on BSC or Avalanche or whatever. And so all of the cool stuff that we built that very few people are aware of over the last 6 to 12 months is going to have this huge moment where everyone's like, wow, this is amazing. And we didn't realize this was happening. There's going to be this, repatriation of all of these new users who came into crypto who don't know about what the Ethereum DeFi ecosystem really looks like. And so I think that that's going to be the story of the next 6 months is people rediscovering Ethereum DeFi on rollups and on layer 2 scaling solutions. And it's just going to suck the air out of a lot of these alt L1s and bring people back into the ecosystem.
I got to throw this over to Robbie next, because of course Robbie, Immutable is building a roll up of the type Kain was just describing. The scalability story is really what Kain is saying. So a lot of quiet building going on the DeFi side. We just haven't had cheap enough transaction fees. We haven't had the scalability to onboard the next cohort of users in order to get us, more and more mainstream. What are you seeing on the Immutable side? Would you say that is sort of the defining era that we're in? We're just kind of scaling right before the next cohort of users. What would you add to this?
I think we have scaled mostly, especially for NFTs. I think DeFi has a way more to go because it's trickier, right? You require composability from day one. You have some costs involved, and the costs really have to essentially go to zero from a user experience perspective for things to become mainstream. We did 2 million NFT transactions over the last month. Ethereum L1 did 1.1. So already, this is, L2 is kind of outperforming at the scale people want to trade at. We've seen since the launch of Immutable, Gods Unchained players go from 20,000 to 200,000 weekly actives to be the third largest blockchain game in the world. We now have massive brands building from kind of GameStop to DC Comics to Disney to Illuvium. And I think what we're seeing is in the NFT space, it's there. The user experience still needs some ironing out. We need to make it magical for people who don't even need to know it's an NFT. But in terms of actual scaling, I think it is there. And the reason I'm so bullish in particular on things like Starknet or kind of the way we approach ZK is we're able to make those costs zero, which is so important for businesses doing NFTs en masse. DeFi is much more fungible token based. And so gas is a different beast. Composability can be more important.
Pat, we have Kain and Robbie talking about how we need to reduce fees so we can onboard users, but also there's an angle here about how when you reduce fees, you can actually build out new applications that you couldn't have if you were only confined to the layer 1. And I think that's been some of your experiences over at Tracer. Can you just speak about the importance of lowering fees down to the absolute minimum, not to only unlock users, but to also unlock developers as well?
Yeah, for sure. As you just said, the cheaper the gas, the more you can really compute on chain and the more complex applications that you can put together, which is only going to add more and more value on the gas front and just the transaction fee front. But I also think 2022, along with the layer 2 and scaling piece, will certainly be a big push around things like identity and UX that will enable what currently somewhat exists as a bit of just its own isolated ecosystem within DeFi and start to bridge the divide between what currently exists within decentralized finance and NFTs to the broader system. So we've seen millions of dollars being invested into a variety of different wallets to improve UX, and we've had a lot of research going into zero knowledge identity systems and KYC systems such that you can trade and transact with these layer 1 or smart contract systems with similar privacy measures in place and similar pseudonymity measures in place, such as it's the same DeFi experience that we all know and love, but it can then scale out into the broader either traditional finance system or just neobanking applications where you're serving millions and millions of users versus people that are currently being onboarded just through being attracted and hearing about some yields and then getting onto MetaMask and navigating through the variety of different bridges and the UX it just really isn't there. So I think the defining trend is certainly consistently going to be around those barriers being broken down and and what we know as DeFi just today becoming what we understand as finance generally moving forward.
Sid, we talked about scalability, of course, a major theme. Pat was just talking about UX and some of those building blocks. What else do you see as some of the trends for DeFi ahead of us from your perspective?
Yeah, I was going to try and offer a bit of a different perspective there. So I think scalability is definitely important, and it's one of the things that we need to get more people on board. But I would also say that we definitely need more supporting infrastructure, like particularly what we see. Maple's obviously a bit more of an institutional focused product. And so what institutions need to really bring huge dollars into DeFi is things like the ability to on-ramp in size really easily in a way that they don't have to like hire, a team of 3 just to manage on-ramping of fiat into stable coins to participate in DeFi. The other one is kind of custody, whether this be self-custody solutions like Fireblocks, where you can implement policies. A lot of institutions seem to favor this, or the use of third-party custodians like Anchorage. So I think these are kind of picks and shovels things that will help bring a lot more dollars into DeFi. And then the other one is, of course, you need to have products that could have like permissioned tracks, so that some of the institutions that had maybe more conservative risk parameters around participating in DeFi could still do so. And then the final element I'll say is just more primary products. So a lot of the products and protocols that kind of came about after DeFi Summer kicked off are ones that capitalized off the use of liquidity mining and yields. But what I think we'll need for DeFi to have sustained growth is that in a world where yields are a little bit lower than what they were during DeFi Summer, do you have primary products that people are coming in and using just because the product itself has more utility that actually solves a need for customers rather than just an ability to participate in yield farming?
Guys, I want to change gears just a little bit as we kind of wrap up in the last 20 minutes of the show. I got to talk about some prices. Got to talk some price action. I actually want to talk about SNX first because DeFi Summer was a fun time. There was a lot of yield farming going on, and SNX had this meme of every single yield farm had an SNX relevant farm towards it. It really just won DeFi Summer just because you could almost farm anything with SNX. Yet DeFi tokens have been down versus ETH basically ever since DeFi Summer. And so leaning into what's going on with the resurgence of the renaissance of DeFi coming on to layer 2s, I have a question for the panel is, what's next, DeFi season or ETH season? Because ETH season it could be ahead of us because of the merge, the issuance reduction, but then also DeFi season could also be ahead of us with the Cambrian explosion of possibility with DeFi apps. So Kain, what say you, DeFi season or ETH season? What's next?
It's a tough one. I think, with the merge coming up, I look at the ETH ratio obviously is the primary way that I measure, most of the things in my portfolio. And like the ETH maxi in me feels like ETH is just going to rip up and kind of leave some of the stuff behind, including SNX and what have you. That said, I think the erosion in the ETH ratio with ETH DeFi that's happened is structurally probably coming from the kind of emergence of NFTs as the dominant theme, right? Because as people got into NFTs, that was one of the only reasons to kind of stay in Ethereum, right? Like most of the cool NFTs were still on Ethereum. There were these kind of small NFT, economies that were growing in alternative L1s, but really ETH still held on and dominated in that respect, in a way that I don't think it did for DeFi. And so I think as the merge happens and as, ETH scaling becomes obvious and as, we get layer 2 tokens like Optimism and Arbitrum and, Starkware, as that kind of happens and we bring all these people back, I think there's no question that ETH rips up. It just has to, right? So like ETH 10K to me, like, if Sassano were here, we wouldn't let him say it. But, I think ETH 10K is so inevitable to me. It's like just laughable, right? That we're not going to get there. But then the question is, okay, can a lot of these DeFi projects, the DeFi blue chips, the kind of core protocols that really deliver the initial utility within the Ethereum ecosystem, can they hang on, right? Like even if the ETH ratio kind of doesn't erode, even if it just holds on, I think that all of those projects will do really well. And so I think outperforming ETH for a lot of DeFis probably feels a little bit unlikely in the short term, like in the next 6 months. But if all of these DeFi projects can just kind of cling on to that ETH ratio that they've got right now, I think they're going to be all pulled up, and I think that will have a compounding effect as we find some new equilibrium price for ETH in the market where, maybe it's 10K or 15K or something like that. Then the DeFi projects will have a chance to outperform and really demonstrate that they're providing utility, they're generating revenue, et cetera. So that's kind of my next 6 to 12 months, I think, is cling on to ETH for dear life, and hope that you don't get left in the dust.
Sid, I saw you chuckling a little bit when I asked that question. So what say you, DeFi season or ETH season next?
DeFi season. I'm definitely DeFi maxi. I think, and this is based on, I'm seeing just so many conversations happen with companies that didn't look at DeFi 12 months ago, or 12 months ago, the narrative was tell us why this is not a scam, to now it's tell us how we can do a project in DeFi. What can we be doing on Ethereum? And so I think the DeFi projects themselves are kind of poised to capture a lot of that value that comes into DeFi. And so I think, you probably have a bit of an ecosystem shakeout where you have, a few sort of tentpole projects that are maybe, or hub projects that then enable sort of spoke or satellite projects around them that kind of provide supporting features and composability, which is, after all, one of the strengths of DeFi, is that we can be composable with each other. And I think, so I think that will drive out performance of DeFi over the next 6 to 12 months.
Patrick, what say you? How are you playing in the next 6 to 12 months? ETH season, DeFi season, what's going to happen?
Yeah, I think with anything, there's going to be shining stars and some stars that sort of crumble along the way as well. But I think overall, when you're talking about DeFi that's settled and cleared in ETH, you obviously need ETH to transact and to settle it and block. So I think we're definitely going to see the growth of both. I'm in both camps there, I'd say, but certainly look forwards to seeing a lot of growth within the user base of DeFi, and I think that's certainly going to accrue to a variety of different protocols that are pushing the edge.
Robbie, last but not least, DeFi season or ETH season, what's happening next?
So DeFi and alts are always going to be way higher beta, so I think we'll see breakout hits. And I'm mostly interested in what will be the first big utility-driven use cases, because still, even up until now, it's either been hypothetical or a group of 100,000 to 1 million rich users kind of creating cool proofs of concept, which is awesome. But the first time we're going to truly see sort of $100 billion DeFi coins breaking up, built on top of Ethereum, is when they start to really take chunks out of the real world. So definitely excited about that, and all of that, as we say, will funnel down to ETH through the transference of value mechanisms, even economic bandwidth.
Well, let's talk
what will outperform?
Yeah, what will outperform? Robbie, what do you think?
Look, I personally hold a lot of DFI because I don't know which particular one will. I mean, I'm a fan of SNX, and it is a good chunk of my portfolio. So
there you go. Let's talk about this. So we're kind of in a rut lately in the global markets, right? A lot has happened this year. Commodity prices, sky high. We've got conflict war in Ukraine. This has brought the price of equities down worldwide. This has also brought the price of crypto down worldwide. Some people are now calling this a bear market and say that this is going to be sort of a repeat of 2018, 2019. Others are still calling for the super cycle. Crypto doesn't have these long persistent bear markets any longer. We've grown beyond that. We've matured. What are you guys seeing, I guess, in the trenches? Does this feel like a 2018, 2019 period to you? Or does this feel like maybe a mild dip before we resume up only super cycle territory? Kain, I know you've lived through many of these years. What do you think?
Honestly, it feels like 2016 to me, like so much like 2016. And I think for the people who are around in 2016, like 2015 was super painful because it was this like sideways thing that just kind of kept going forever, and you felt like this slow erosion of hope, right? Like there was just this slow sense of like, is this just decaying to zero, but in slow motion, right? And then 2016 happened, and basically 2016 was like up only, right? Like there were a couple of like little spikes and like a couple of little pumps and then crashes and stuff. But I think most people who were in the space and had been in the space for long enough, like were kind of a bit immune to that and a bit inured to it. They were kind of like, okay, this is fine. But if you look at the chart of 2016, it literally is just like, it starts here and it ends there. And, like the Bitcoin chart is like, I don't know, 400, like 700, right? So it's like a laughable amount of money that it went up. But like percentage wise, it almost doubled. Right. And I think that was true for the entire crypto market cap at the time, right, through 2016. And it just feels like there's always going to be macro headwinds. Like you can't avoid it. There's just going to be dumb shit that happens in the world that, makes people a little bit hesitant. Crypto is still a risk on asset. But throughout 2016, just the momentum kept building, right? Like, and yeah, a lot of it was from ICOs but like every single month there was like something that was just like building up. And that's what this year has felt like. It's like, oh, this scaling solution now finally works. Oh, this cool thing happened, or this big company adopted crypto. And it's just like layer. Ignore the macro, and it's just very clearly up only. So I think this is from my perspective, we're gonna get to the end of the year and be like, what the fuck are we all so worried about? Like, why are we all freaking out? Like it was fine. This was actually a fine year. But in the midst of it, it feels like, it feels scary. But I think like you zoom out, it's fine. We're going to be fine.
Robbie, you were shaking your head up and down a little bit. What do you think about this?
From the NFT perspective, which is kind of the world I live in most of the time, and in particular, business applications of NFTs, less like luxury art and more like games, businesses adopting it, the signals could not be more bullish. So I think we had $26 billion of NFT volume in the first quarter of 2022, which is more than the entirety of 2021. We have $50 billion in VC capital ready to be deployed over the next 5 years in crypto alone. Like this is the most insane pouring in of capital in any nascent industry in the history of the world, adjusted for inflation. We have, like, if you look at the two most leading indicators of whether an industry will be successful, it's like where does venture capital money go, because it's their job to be prescient, and it's where do people spend their time, because that's what people are excited by. And we're also seeing a huge outpouring of talent. Like every large gaming organization in Web 2, all of their people are leaving to Web 3. Same for like financial services. We're going to see the same for verticals as they become tokenized. And so like, to me, the actual nature of adoption has been crazy. Like we now have a call with any major Web2 gaming company in the world, and they have a desk of at least 20, if not 100 or more full-time people working on their Web3 strategy. Whereas like 15 months ago, they wouldn't know the word NFT.
That's incredible. Neither of our panelists, our two panelists who we've heard from sound bearish at all. Sid, what do things look like from your perspective, from the Maple perspective?
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo this and say definitely bullish on the space. I don't see bearish sentiment at all. I think we are probably a different fragment of DeFi where it's more kind of lending and fixed income, and so I think that is naturally kind of correlates with there is more interest in it when there's a bit of a risk off environment. So we've seen a lot of interest in corporates and treasuries being able to get a bit of a stable yield. So that's naturally played to our strength. But I think, just echoing what Robbie said, we're seeing, kind of unprecedented interest from VC funds that have freshly raised that are looking to deploy this in DeFi, as well as like on the hiring front, we're at about 30 people now. And every time we post a new role, each new role that we post gets kind of like a record number of applicants coming from TradFi as well. So if it's like a sales or an operations role, it's like, you'll get more than 50, 60 applicants kind of coming from TradFi positions. So I think all this speaks to just increasing interest in the space. And I would contrast this with 2018, where there was a bit of an era of capitulation on the fundamentals. But here it's kind of like that Carlota Perez idea, whereas maybe like valuations have kind of declined relative to the momentum that has been built up on the fundamental side in terms of what's being built.
Yeah, this all sounds incredibly bullish. Pat, what do you think?
Yeah, a lot's been said there. As adoption increases, it's pretty hard for the industry not to grow. Adoption's just going to keep on increasing there too. But I think just on the global macro level, and I wouldn't call myself an expert on that front at all, but I think Arthur Hayes' article recently touching on the cancelling of Russia effectively, and a lot of just the systems and services that the West has been able to provide over the last years just being cut off. I think that's a bull case for systems like DeFi, of course, having infrastructure that is neutral in its accessibility, and having that trusted layer at the base layer that anybody can be interacting with. I think more and more value is going to accrue to these decentralized systems as we see more of those types of events happen, and the global economic control tend more towards individuals being empowered. And this is the infrastructure that we're here for.
Well, panelists, what a fantastic way to end it. This is the infrastructure we are here for. This is certainly, if not the year of DeFi, decentralized finance and crypto, it's certainly the decade. I mean, just take a look at what's going on in the world today and look at how many problems are solved by crypto. I want to thank each of the panelists for hanging with us on this Bankless live stream, and also, hello to everyone in Australian Blockchain Week. It is great to talk to you guys. Thank you so much, panelists. We appreciate you.